After making the biggest trade in franchise history to acquire Damian Lillard from the Portland Trail Blazers, I think everything that could have possibly gone wrong for the Milwaukee Bucks did go wrong. And it all started just 4 days after the blockbuster, as the Portland Trail Blazers moved the centerpiece of the Dame trade in Jrue Holiday to the Boston Celtics in exchange for Malcolm Brogdon, Robert Williams, and future draft compensation. This move not only significantly boosted the Celtics' title odds, but it formed one of the most lethal starting fives the league has ever seen. But just wait, it gets worse, because not even 3 weeks later, Bucks lead assistant coach Terry Stotts stepped down from his position literally a week before the regular season tipped off due to an incident with first-year head coach Adrian Griffin during a preseason shoot-around in Oklahoma City, which was a much bigger deal than people made it out to be, considering Stotts was viewed as the offensive coordinator of the Bucks' entire operation, and he was ultimately the key to unlocking Damian Lillard in this system, given that he coached the then 7-time All-Star for the first 9 seasons of his career. So to lose Stotts just a week before tip-off was a massive blow, and it revealed the first of many red flags about rookie head coach Adrian Griffin, who ended up getting fired just 43 games into the season. And at first, this was a surprise to many NBA fans, because at the time, the Bucks were 30-13, good for the second best record in the Eastern Conference. So from an outside perspective, it didn't make a whole lot of sense, until you realized that the Bucks were a bottom 10 defense, despite the foundation of this core being built upon elite defense. And I get it, losing a perennial all-defensive guard in Jrue Holiday and replacing him with Damian Lillard isn't exactly ideal, but Coach Griff's defensive scheme made straight up no sense. He put a heavy emphasis on ball pressure, which meant a ton of switches and a lot of trapping out on the perimeter. And this would be a solid defensive scheme if you had a ton of length and switchable defenders 1 through 5. But Coach Griff just didn't have this. He tasked Malik Beasley with taking on the most difficult perimeter assignments night in and night out, and Bees is not a good point of attack defender. Not to mention, this type of scheme constantly forced Brook Lopez out onto the perimeter, where he is virtually non-existent at the point of attack. So teams would constantly seek out BL in the pick and roll, exploit his lack of lateral quickness, and then burn Milwaukee's lack of rim protection without Lopez to man the middle. Bucks veterans urged Coach Griffin to scrap this game plan entirely and return Brook Lopez to the drop coverage that he'd been playing ever since he got to Milwaukee. The same coverage that had seen Lopez finish second in the Defensive Player of the Year voting just a season prior. But by the time Griff finally made the adjustment, it was already too late, as he had lost the locker room by late November, and the team still didn't even look like it had established a defensive identity. The offense, on the other hand, was historically dominant at the time, but even that felt somewhat underwhelming because it never really seemed like Damian Lillard found his footing, and his connection with Giannis just wasn't there yet. Combine all of this with the fact that the Bucks struggled to get by inferior teams, and the front office decided that they just couldn't keep Griff any longer, which led to the hiring of Doc Rivers, who immediately patched up some of those defensive woes, but the team as a whole remained mediocre, and the Bucks actually ended up having a worse record under Doc Rivers to finish the season than they did with Griff to begin it, and the media slammed the Bucks for this. But wait, it continues to get worse, because on April 9th, 2024, the Milwaukee Bucks season officially ended.
We're keeping an eye on Giannis here. He just sat down on the floor and kind of looking at his left lower leg.
Antetokounmpo ended up suffering a left soleus strain that caused him to miss the entirety of Milwaukee's first-round playoff series against Indiana, and the injury bug infected Damian Lillard as well, who went on to miss 2 of the 6 games in that series himself. Chris Middleton tried to be the hero the Bucks needed, but he just didn't have enough help, and for the second consecutive season, the Bucks fell in round 1, Which brings us to the current offseason, where I honestly expected the downfall of this team to continue because Jon Horst really had no financial flexibility whatsoever to improve this roster, given the Bucks were in line to cross the NBA's second tax apron, which restricts teams from being able to use their mid-level, the buyout market, or aggregate salaries and trades. So despite Brook Lopez and Pat Connaughton reportedly being on the trade block to begin the offseason, the Bucks' options in any potential trade were extremely limited. And that's even if they were able to find any suitors for a 36-year-old Lopez and a severely regressed Connaughton, who makes nearly $10 million a year. So it seemed like the Bucks' best hope might have been to re-sign a couple of their own guys like Pat Beverley and Malik Beasley, bank on the internal development of the young guys in Marjon Beauchamp, Andre Jackson Jr., and even the rookies AJ Johnson and Tyler Smith, and just run it back and pray that you stay healthy. But even in that scenario, I don't like their odds against the Celtics, so all hope seemed lost. But Jon Horst pulled a Houdini, letting all 5 of the Bucks' unrestricted free agents walk, and replacing them with Delon Wright, Taurean Prince, and Gary Trent Jr., all of whom were signed on minimum contracts. So if you look at the 5 players the Bucks added, and the 5 players they lost, I would say they significantly improved, because I'd much rather have the young talent of AJ Johnson and Tyler Smith over any of those aging veterans. And if you look at the 1-to-1 value of Gary Trent versus Malik Beasley and Taurean Prince versus Jay Crowder, those are big time upgrades. Delon Wright and Pat Beverley's value is probably pretty similar, but Wright is 4 years younger and will most definitely hold up better over the course of an 82-game season. So now the only question is, how will these new pieces fit, and what will they bring to the table next season? For the rookies in AJ Johnson and Tyler Smith, I don't really expect them to have much of a role on the actual team, and I'm pretty confident they'll spend most of their time with the herd next season. But I do really like the flashes I've seen from them so far in Summer League, and I'll have a full video breaking that down very soon. But in the meantime, let's talk about the free agent signings. Starting with Delon Wright, who put up about 5 points, 2 boards, and 3 assists a night on 39% from the field and 37% from deep over the course of 47 regular season games with Washington and Miami last season. So as the numbers may suggest, Delon's impact goes beyond the box score, as he's one of the smartest defenders at the guard position in the entire league. Standing at 6'5" with a 6'7" wingspan, Wright has ideal size and length that allows him to guard 1 through 3 pretty effectively. He isn't as effective at the point of attack as he was in his younger days, given he's lost a touch of agility moving laterally, but he's still fully capable of bothering his matchup one-on-one, as he uses his length and active hands to make up for a lack of strength and his slight loss of lateral quickness when defending on the ball. But where Delon really makes his mark is off the ball defensively. His active hands as an on-ball defender perfectly translate to being a disruptor off the ball in passing lanes. So much so that he earned the nickname the King of Deflections when playing in Washington. And that nickname's no joke, because Wright ranked second in steals per 36 minutes of players that played in at least 30 games last season. Much of this can be attributed to his flawless rotations, which seemingly always have him in the right position to get a stop, even to the point where he can make plays with his back turned to the ball, almost like he has eyes behind his head. And because of this, he thrives at chasing around shooters on the perimeter and can make their lives a living hell for 48 minutes. And speaking of shooters, Delon himself is one, as he's coming off a season in which he converted on just over 41% of his catch and shoot 3-point attempts, which is big time for the Bucks' floor spacing, especially when you consider the fact that he's a smart off guard who understands where he needs to be on the floor. And traditionally, this is in the corner spotting up. So although he'll likely be Damian Lillard's backup on the depth chart, I expect Wright to play a decent amount of minutes next to Dame next season, given what he brings to the table. And it's not like Delon is some stellar floor general anyways. He's a fine playmaker, and most of his reads are pretty basic, but he does excel at knowing when to make the extra pass, which fits in perfectly alongside Milwaukee's stars. But when he does need to run the second unit, he should be capable enough to do so. And he's certainly not the worst on-ball creator in the world. Obviously, it's not really what he does, nor will it ever be his role, but when need be, Delon is pretty smart about how he attacks a mismatch, as he's very patient in reading what the defense is giving him, and will traditionally lull opposing defenders to sleep by resetting the possession before quickly changing speeds and attacking the basket. So Wright gives the Bucks a lot of versatility at the guard position. Which brings us to the next big acquisition, Taurean Prince. TP's coming off a really solid season with the Lakers, in which he put up about 9 points and 3 boards on 44% from the field and 40% from deep. But the stat that really sticks out to me when it comes to Prince is his catch and shoot 3-point percentage. Because it's the exact same as his overall 3-point percentage, meaning Taurean's best ability on the offensive end is probably his awareness of his own role. As we just mentioned, he's a quality catch and shoot 3-point shooter who thrived off the space created by LeBron James and other primary ball handlers like D'Angelo Russell and Austin Reeves during this past season. So in a system where he'll be playing alongside the likes of Dame, Giannis, Chris Middleton, and even Gary Trent Jr., who we'll get to in a minute, Prince should continue to thrive. And with so much attention focused on the players I just named, it'll make Prince's ability to attack late closeouts that much more impactful. Because even if TP is having an off night from deep, he can still make an impact offensively, given he's one of the most underrated players in the league at attacking closeouts and finishing on the interior, as he's coming off a year in which he shot 63% within the restricted area on just about 100 attempts. Combine this with the fact that Prince is a decent off-ball cutter, and he'll fit right in with this Milwaukee offense. As for the defense, at 6'6", 218, Taurean is well equipped to guard 1 through 3, especially given his 7-foot wingspan. He does also have the capability to defend some 4s, but it's definitely not something he specializes in. He should mainly stick to defending 2s and 3s. Anyways, Prince is a serviceable on-ball defender at the point of attack, given he moves his feet pretty well and uses his length to provide good contests. However, when matched up with players that have more burst than him, he can get exposed, because those types of players usually have no issue forcing Taurean to open his hips, especially when he plays them too close. And this can get even more nightmarish in the pick and roll, because Prince isn't a very good screen navigator and usually never recovers when defending behind the play. But the only reason Taurean's defensive abilities were put on blast more so last season than in years past is because of how the Lakers used him. Darvin Ham deployed Prince like he was frickin' Herb Jones, constantly putting him on the opposing team's top perimeter threat, and while on some nights he may seem up to this task, the reality is he's just not that type of defender, and he shouldn't be taking on those matchups on a nightly basis, because his true value defensively isn't as an on-ball defender, rather it's off the ball. He's relatively high IQ, his rotations are sound, a good weak side help defender when he needs to be, and he's pretty good at noticing plays before they develop. The only problem with that is that in those type of situations, he tends to overplay his matchup, and he often gets beat. So if Prince finds a way to correct that flaw, he'd be one of the better off-ball defenders in the game. Which leads us to the final and most shocking addition to the Milwaukee Bucks, Gary Trent Jr. This past season in Toronto, Trent put up about 14 points, 3 boards, and 2 assists on 43% from the field and 39% from deep. Like Prince and Delon Wright, Trent Jr. is another guy who will thrive off of and maximize the Bucks' floor spacing, as he's coming off a season in which he shot 43% from 3 off the catch and a ridiculous 51% from deep on wide open attempts. And the craziest part is, he put up those numbers with the Raptors' horrendous floor spacing. So I wouldn't be surprised if those already impressive numbers continued to jump in Milwaukee, similarly to how they did for Malik Beasley this past season. But what separates Trent Jr. from Bees is the fact that he's not just a catch and shoot guy. He's someone who can get his own shot if need be, and he can do it at all 3 levels, as he shot about 61% in the restricted area and almost 40% in the mid-range this past year. And while those may not be the most efficient marks in the world, they at least prove that he's a capable 3-level scorer, as Trent's pretty good at getting to his spots in the mid-range after attacking a closeout by displaying a nice floater to pair with a solid step back and fadeaway jumper in that area. Off the ball offensively, he's extremely involved as a slasher, whether he's running in action or taking advantage of his man falling asleep. And the most underrated aspect of his offensive bag is the transition game. Because Trent is so good at forcing turnovers, he'll have a lot of opportunities where he'll just take it himself coast to coast, but he's also a really good spot-up shooter in transition. Hence why he averaged nearly 4 points per game in transition this past season, and he did it on an effective field goal percentage of over 65%, which ranks in the 81st percentile of transition scorers. So Trent will be pretty lethal next to Giannis in transition next season. But the only real gripes I have about Gary Trent Jr. as an offensive player are his sometimes questionable shot selection and the fact that he can be a streaky shooter. But other than that, he's essentially a pure scorer on that end of the ball, which leads us to the opposite end of the ball, where my analysis of Trent's abilities aren't as positive. At 6'5", 209 with a 6'9" wingspan, Gary has the ideal frame required to be a solid defender at his position. But he's just kinda underwhelming. As an on-ball defender, his length and active hands are his best attributes, because even if you have Trent beat off the dribble, his ability to recover is pretty solid, and his length allows him to do a nice job of contesting without fouling. But that's where the on-ball positives end, because at the point of attack, Trent struggles to keep his man in front of him, and he often just resorts to swiping at the ball until he gets blown by. Combine this with the fact that he doesn't do a great job of beating his matchup to the spot, and he can sometimes look like a turnstile. And as you probably figured, all of this means that Trent isn't really an effective on-ball screen navigator either, as he usually dies at the first point of contact, and that creates an advantage for the opposing offense. However, Trent is a pretty solid screen navigator off the ball, as he does a decent job against movement shooters, and again, that length on the contest can come in handy against those type of players. Another thing working in Gary's favor off the ball are his active hands, which he uses to read the passing lanes and completely blow up plays at times, which explains why he's usually near the top of the league in steals per game, year in and year out. But the problem with this style of off-ball defense, at least in the more recent seasons, is that it's just not disciplined. Way too often is Trent overplaying the passing lanes and losing sight of his man because he's immensely out of position. He simply just spends too much time ball watching and gambling for steals that it hurts his effectiveness as an off-ball defender. So as good as he might be at forcing turnovers, he's equally as good at allowing layups. And because of that, I'd have to say that Trent was a defensive negative last season. But you've got to remember that the Raptors as a whole were a bottom 5 defense, and with Giannis and Brook as backline defenders, that helps out with some of the gambling that Trent does defensively, which doesn't even mention the fact that Trent is going to be extremely motivated on a 1-year prove-it deal. So maybe that unleashes some of the defensive potential we saw out of Gary in his earlier years. And I mean, even Malik Beasley's point of attack defense improved ever so slightly under Doc Rivers. So all hope in Trent's abilities as a point of attack defender may not be lost. But with all that being said, the Bucks had a really underrated offseason given the limited tools that they had to work with. Signing 3 quality rotational pieces on the minimum, all of whom are better than their predecessors, is absolutely insane value. And the team only got younger with the draft day additions of AJ Johnson and Tyler Smith. The Bucks got better. I still don't think that this team has enough to dethrone Boston in the East, but this was a step in the right direction. The rest ultimately lies in the development we see out of the young guys, and whether or not Dame and Giannis can put the pieces together and become the most dominant duo in basketball.